My name is Vanessa Cole. I am 36 years old, and my family threw every last one of my belongings onto the driveway the exact same night they believed I had lost my job. They gave me 60 minutes to pack 2 battered old suitcases in a driving rainstorm, screaming at me that I was a worthless drain on their household, a burden they could no longer afford to carry. They were terrified about who was going to cover their mortgage, their leased Range Rover, and their country club dues. And not one of them ever thought to ask what I actually did for a living. If they had bothered to ask, even once, they would have discovered that I had not lost my job at all. I had just quietly finished acquiring the company. Before I get into it, let me know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. And if you've ever had to walk away from family who only loved you for what you could hand them, go ahead and hit like and subscribe, because this one is for you. I grew up in a beautiful colonial house on a tree-lined street in Highland Park, just outside Dallas, Texas, in a family where appearances were the only currency that ever mattered. My parents, Richard and Elaine Cole, spent their entire lives performing wealth they did not actually have. We lived in a 5-bedroom house with a manicured lawn and a gleaming leased Range Rover in the driveway. And from the street, we looked like the picture of a perfect, successful American family. Behind the front door, it was something else entirely. It was a courtroom where I was always, somehow, the one on trial. My younger sister Paige was the golden child, the one who could do no wrong, no matter how much wrong she actually did. At 31 years old, she called herself a luxury interior designer, though she hadn't closed a single paid project in over a year. She drove a leased Mercedes G-Wagon, carried a rotating collection of designer handbags she could not afford, and was married to a man named Trevor Sinclair. Trevor billed himself as an elite private wealth advisor, always dressed in a bespoke navy suit, always talking about the deal of a lifetime that was perpetually one signature away. What none of them knew was that Trevor was buried under 6 figures of predatory business debt, quietly bleeding out behind his crisp white collar. I was the one who kept the lights on. For 11 years, my family believed I was nothing more than a mid-level administrative coordinator at a regional marketing firm. They mocked my plain blazers, my sensible shoes, my quiet Tuesday nights in instead of out at rooftop bars. What they did not know, what I made absolutely certain they never found out, was that I was the anonymous majority owner of Meridian Group, a brand strategy and holding company worth just north of $2 billion. I had spent years playing the role of the invisible, forgettable daughter, on purpose, quietly watching my own company from the inside while I planned a hostile takeover of a corrupt board that had been looting it for a decade. To my family, though, I was just Vanessa, the spinster sister, the one who quietly wired money whenever the household accounts ran dry, and who never got so much as a thank you for it. It was a wet Thursday night in late February, and the 6 of us were gathered around the heavy mahogany table in my parents' dining room. The pot roast was overcooked and dry, and the air in the room was so tight you could have cut it with the butter knife sitting next to my plate. Paige was loudly complaining that the Dallas luxury market had gone ice cold, and that her commissions were non-existent. Trevor was cutting his meat with far more aggression than the situation called for, muttering something about a client who wouldn't return his calls. I sat quietly, eating my mashed potatoes, running through the final closing documents for my acquisition in my head, 3 days out from the biggest deal of my career. My phone was sitting face up beside my water glass when it buzzed against the wood, loud and sharp. The screen lit up with a notification from the corporate systems team at Meridian Group. The subject line read, "Employment Record Update, Effective Immediately." I felt a small, satisfying rush of triumph. That notification meant the final piece of my takeover had cleared. The old shell entity that had been quietly siphoning money out of the company for years was gone, dissolved, and the new holding structure, mine, entirely mine, was now fully in control. I reached for the phone to silence it, but Paige was faster. Her manicured hand shot across the table, knocking over her wine glass in the process, and she snatched the phone straight out of my fingers before I could stop her. Her eyes scanned the screen and she read the subject line out loud for the whole table to hear. "Employment Record Update, Effective Immediately." Paige's voice climbed into a shriek that bounced off the dining room walls. She set the phone down like it had burned her. "Are you serious right now, Vanessa? Did you actually get fired from your little admin job?" My mother gasped, clutching her napkin to her chest like she'd just watched someone die. My father slammed his fist on the table hard enough to rattle the silverware. I opened my mouth to explain, calmly, that this was a corporate restructuring and not a termination, but Paige didn't give me a single second of air. "You have got to be kidding me." Paige stood up so fast her chair screeched against the hardwood. Her face flushed a deep, furious red. "Do you have any idea what this means for me? My mortgage is $4,200 a month. My HOA dues are due on Friday. I am completely underwater on that penthouse, and I was counting on your year-end bonus to help me cover the gap. How exactly am I supposed to keep living the life I've built if you can't even hold down a desk job?" Before I could respond to the sheer audacity of that statement, Trevor slammed his own fist down beside hers, adjusting the cuffs of a suit I happened to know had been purchased on a store credit card at 19% interest. He looked at me like I had personally insulted him. "Unbelievable, Vanessa." He shook his head slowly, dripping with condescension. "Do you understand what kind of week I'm having? I am 2 days away from closing the single biggest wealth management account of my career. A tech founder worth 9 figures. I need my head completely clear right now, and I cannot have this kind of broke energy anywhere near my household." The irony of that statement was almost funny. Trevor was drowning in more debt than anyone at that table, financed entirely on the hope that one enormous client would wash it all away. He needed my quiet, reliable income just as badly as Paige did. His fragile ego would simply never let him admit it out loud. "Oh, you poor things." My mother, Elaine, cooed at Paige and Trevor, completely ignoring the fact that her eldest daughter had, as far as she knew, just lost her only source of income. She rushed around the table and wrapped her arms around Paige, who was now producing theatrical, tearless sobs into a silk napkin. My father, Richard, rose to his full height and pointed a thick finger directly at my face. "Look at what you've done to your sister and your brother-in-law." His face went a dull shade of purple. "They are out here building something. Real wealth, real connections, real stress. And what exactly are you doing with your life? You are 36 years old. You've sat at the same low-level desk for over a decade, and you couldn't even manage to keep that. We let you live under this roof so you could help this family, and this is how you repay us?" I looked around that elegant, over-decorated dining room and took in the full absurdity of it. I was 36, yes, but I had quietly paid off the second mortgage on that house 4 years earlier. I covered the property taxes every single autumn. I paid the utility bills that kept the lights on and the pool heated. I even covered the country club membership that let my father brag to his golf buddies about his successful family. They had all convinced themselves, somehow, That because I lived simply and dressed plainly, I was a burden they were generously enduring. This is exactly why you're still single and living at home, Paige spat, dabbing at eyes that had never actually produced a tear. You have no ambition, Vanessa. Trevor and I are dealing with real adult problems. HOA. Fees, car leases, networking events we have to fund just to stay relevant. We were counting on your bonus to close our escrow gap, and you threw it away. I never promised either of you a single dollar, I said, keeping my voice level and calm. How dare you speak to her like that? My mother's voice cracked with fury as she clutched the pearls at her throat. Your sister is under enormous financial pressure. The luxury market is frozen right now. Nobody's buying. And she is the victim of a terrible economy. You are the victim of your own incompetence. You should be apologizing to both of them for putting their security at risk. She's right. Trevor leaned back in his chair with the kind of unearned confidence only a man drowning in debt could summon. In my business, we cut dead weight the second it stops performing. If a client isn't producing, you drop them and move on. Families should work the same way, Vanessa. Everyone contributes to the win. Right now, you're just a liability. And if my deal falls through Thursday because I'm too stressed out about Paige losing her penthouse, that's on you. I stared at him, genuinely stunned by the sheer scope of the delusion required to blame a 36-year-old woman for his own inability to close a client. I opened my mouth to point out that my employment status had exactly nothing to do with his fragile professional confidence, but my mother stood up before I could get a word out. Her chair scraped hard against the hardwood floor. She said nothing at first. Her expression settled into a cold, flat line I recognized instantly from every disappointment of my childhood. She turned without another word and walked out of the dining room, her heels clicking sharply down the hallway. The rest of us sat in silence. Paige kept dabbing her dry eyes, occasionally shooting me a look that could curdle milk. Trevor scrolled his phone theatrically, playing the part of the important man being inconvenienced by petty family drama. A few minutes later, my mother reappeared in the doorway, dragging 2 battered brown suitcases behind her. I recognized them instantly. They were the same cheap bags I had packed for my dorm room the day I left for college, over a decade earlier. She hauled them across the Persian rug and dropped them at my feet with a heavy thud that shook the floor. "What is this?" I asked, my voice quiet, though a cold knot had already formed in my stomach. My father cleared his throat and leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, looking at me the way a ruthless manager looks at an employee he's about to let go. "We've made a decision, Vanessa." His voice had no warmth left in it at all. "Your mother and I have talked it through, and we have to be practical. You are officially unemployed now. No income, no prospects, nothing to contribute to this household." Meanwhile, Paige and Trevor are dealing with a serious, temporary cash flow problem. He gestured toward them, and they sat up a little straighter, looking entirely too pleased with themselves. "It makes no financial sense for Paige to keep paying $4,200 a month for a penthouse she can't afford anymore. And it makes even less sense for you to keep occupying the guest suite downstairs while contributing absolutely nothing to this house." "So Paige and Trevor are moving back in," I said quietly, "to save money." "It is not your house, Vanessa." My mother's eyes flashed as she snapped at me. "It is ours, and we need the space. Paige and Trevor are trying to start a family. They're the future of this bloodline. Your room is going to be converted into a nursery for our grandchildren. What exactly would you even use it for? Sitting around in sweatpants filling out applications for entry-level jobs? You should have thought about your living situation before you let yourself get fired," Paige added, arms crossed. a small, triumphant smile tugging at her mouth. My father stood, towering over the table, and delivered the final blow. "We are not running a charity, Vanessa. You are a grown woman. We gave you a roof over your head and you got comfortable. This is the tough love you clearly need to finally get your life together. You have 60 minutes. 60 minutes for what? My heart was pounding, though my face stayed still. 60 minutes to pack your things and get off this property. My father checked his gold watch. You'll leave your key on the kitchen counter. You take only what fits in those 2 bags. Everything else gets donated tomorrow morning. If you're not gone by 9 o'clock, I will call the police and have you removed for trespassing." The silence that followed was total. I looked around at the 4 faces staring back at me. My mother, who cared more about a hypothetical grandchild than the daughter standing in front of her. My father, who treated his own child like a failed line item on a balance sheet. My sister, actively stealing my sanctuary to fund her collapsing lifestyle. My brother-in-law, watching a family tear itself apart over money and saying nothing to stop it. They were waiting for me to break. They wanted to watch me fall apart so they could feel justified in their cruelty. But looking down at those 2 scuffed suitcases on the floor, I didn't feel sadness at all. I felt something closer to relief. I pushed my chair back and stood without shedding a single tear, without offering a single word of protest. I looked my father directly in the eyes, memorized the coldness sitting there, and gave him one short nod. "Your 60 minutes starts now," he barked. I turned and walked up the carpeted stairs to my room for the very last time. The space was small and plain, a quiet corner I had carefully kept invisible while I built an empire 2,000 miles away in Manhattan. I didn't waste a second looking at the old photographs on the dresser, or the mismatched hand-me-down furniture my parents had never bothered to replace. I went straight to the false panel behind my closet and opened the small safe hidden there. Inside were the only things that actually mattered: 2 encrypted laptops, a thick folder of certified legal documents proving my full and sole ownership of Meridian Group, and a hardware wallet holding assets worth more than every property my family had ever bragged about combined. I packed them carefully into my leather work bag. Then I moved to the closet and pulled a few neutral blazers, some plain trousers, and a pair of flats into the 2 brown suitcases my mother had thrown down at my feet. I was zipping the second bag shut when my door swung open without a knock. Paige marched in, eyes bright with a greedy, frantic energy. She wasn't there to say goodbye. She was there to claim territory. She walked straight past me into my small bathroom and began sweeping my modest skincare products off the counter into a black trash bag, muttering about how she'd need the shelf space for her own things. "What exactly are you doing?" I asked. "Claiming what's mine." She didn't even look up. "This is going to be my dressing room now. You should be grateful we're letting you take anything at all." I didn't argue. I zipped the second bag, slung my work bag over my shoulder, and walked past her without another word. I carried my 2 suitcases down the stairs, past my parents standing at the bottom watching me like a security guard watching a shoplifter leave the store, and out the front door into a cold, driving February rain. The door shut behind me with a heavy, final click. I stood on the driveway for a moment, rain soaking through my blazer, looking back at the warm, glowing windows of the house I had quietly paid for. Then I turned, wheeled my 2 bags to the curb, and called a car. I did not go to a friend's couch. I did not check into a budget motel. I checked in to the Rosewood Mansion penthouse suite I already kept under a corporate account, dried off, opened my laptop, and got back to work. because I had a deal to close in 3 days, and nothing, not even my own family standing in the freezing rain, was going to slow that down. Let me back up for a moment, because you need to understand exactly what my family didn't know they were dealing with. 11 years earlier, fresh out of business school, I had taken an entry-level marketing job at a mid-sized brand consultancy called Halloway and Reed. I was quiet, unremarkable, forgettable by design. What nobody in that office knew was that I had spent every night after work building a second company from my laptop, a boutique digital branding firm I called Meridian Group. I built it slowly, methodically, taking on small clients Halloway and Reed considered beneath them. I never told a soul at my day job. I never told my family. I simply worked twice as hard as anyone around me and let them assume I was exactly what I appeared to be, a tired, unambitious woman who never seemed to move up. By the time I turned 30, Meridian Group had quietly grown into a real operation, and I made the decision that changed everything. Halloway and Reed was slowly collapsing under a corrupt executive board that was bleeding the company dry through inflated consulting contracts with their own shell companies. I saw an opportunity through a private holding entity registered under my mother's maiden name, so no filing would ever trace back to me. I began buying up distressed shares of Halloway and Reed, one small block at a time, over the course of 6 years. I kept my day job the entire time. I kept living in my childhood bedroom. I kept letting my family believe I was a nobody, because the less attention I drew, the more freely I could operate. 3 days before that dinner, my holding company had finally crossed the threshold. Majority ownership. The termination notice that had lit up my phone at that table wasn't me getting fired. It was corporate HR formally closing out my old employee file, because the acquisition had gone through, and the company I had once quietly clocked into every morning at 8:45 now belonged, in full, to me. My family had no idea any of this had happened. They had no idea Meridian Group even existed under that name, because I had rebranded the moment the takeover closed, scrubbing every trace of Halloway and Reed from the public record. As far as the world was concerned, Meridian Group had simply appeared as one of the fastest-growing branding and asset management conglomerates on the East Coast, run by a notoriously private, notoriously reclusive founder nobody had ever photographed. That founder was me. 3 weeks passed. I moved out of the Rosewood Suite and into a property I had bought 2 years earlier under yet another shell entity. A modern glass and cedar house perched on a private stretch of coastline in Malibu, the kind of place my family would have called obscene if they'd known it existed, let alone that it was mine. I split my time between there and the Meridian Group headquarters in Manhattan, finally able to walk through my own building's front doors without pretending to be anyone other than exactly who I was. Back in Highland Park, things were unraveling fast, though I only learned the details later, pieced together from people who had no idea how closely their stories would eventually intersect with mine. Paige had not sold a single property in 14 months. Her broker, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Georgia Kwan, had given her 3 separate warnings, each one more pointed than the last, and Paige had ignored every single one of them. She spent her mornings posting staged photos of houses she didn't own outside million-dollar listings, captioned with hashtags about grit and glow-up energy, while her actual sales pipeline sat completely empty. Her HOA account was 2 payments behind, her Mercedes lease was 1 missed payment from repossession, and now, with me gone and my quiet contributions gone with me, the little cushion that had kept her afloat for years had disappeared overnight. It was a Tuesday morning when a new listing landed in the office's shared client portal, and Paige happened to be standing closest to the printer when it came through. The file was thick, glossy, and stamped with a cover sheet that read, "Exclusive listing, Horizon Trust Group, confidential client." Attached were high-resolution photographs of a striking modern estate on the Malibu coastline, floor-to-ceiling glass walls, an infinity pool that seemed to spill directly into the Pacific, and an asking lease value that made Paige's stomach flip with excitement. A junior agent named Greg reached for the file first, but Paige practically tackled him for it. "I'm taking this lead," she said, breathless, physically stepping between Greg and the manager's office door. "I have connections in the California luxury market. My brother-in-law represents elite clients who buy houses exactly like this all the time. I can have an offer on this property by Friday." The managing broker stepped out of her office, studied Paige for a long moment, clocking the slightly manic edge behind her confidence, and finally sighed. The firm needed a commission this size just as badly as Paige did. "Fine," Georgia said, rubbing her temples. "You can have the Horizon Trust Group lead. But if you blow this or embarrass this office in front of a client of this caliber, I will pull your license paperwork myself before the state board even gets involved. Are we clear?" "Crystal," Paige said, already snatching the file out of Greg's hands. She strutted back to her desk, feeling like she'd just won the lottery, flipping through the photographs and mentally spending a commission she hadn't earned yet. She had absolutely no idea that Horizon Trust Group was one of 11 shell entities I had personally formed years earlier to hold real estate assets at arm's length from my name. She had no idea that the exclusive Malibu estate in those glossy photographs was the exact house I was currently living in, the one where I drank my morning coffee on a deck overlooking the ocean my family had no idea I could even see from my own kitchen window. My trap, though I hadn't set it as a trap so much as let the world set it for me, was quietly falling into place. And my sister, so certain she was the smartest person in any room she walked into, had sprinted headfirst toward it without a second of hesitation. While Paige chased her fantasy commission, Trevor was facing his own unraveling in a cramped, rented office above a strip mall dry cleaner in downtown Dallas. His air conditioning had been broken for 2 weeks, but the sweat beating on his forehead had nothing to do with the heat. His phone had been buzzing nonstop for the better part of an hour. The name on the screen read, Marcus Webb. Marcus wasn't just any client. He was the founder of a fast-growing fintech startup that had just closed a massive Series C round, a 9-figure valuation, and the kind of generational wealth story that could make an advisor's entire career. He was Trevor's one shot at digging out of the hole he'd buried himself in. Trevor finally answered, forcing an easy, confident tone into his voice, as if Marcus could see the panic behind it. "Marcus, my man, we're looking solid heading into next quarter." "I don't want to talk about next quarter." Marcus's voice was flat, businesslike, entirely without warmth. "I just got off the phone with my board. We're thinking bigger picture here. Brand positioning, national press, a real growth story before our Series D. My board wants a top-tier strategy partner locked in before we move forward with you managing a single additional dollar." "Absolutely," Trevor said quickly, already pulling up a generic slide deck on his laptop. "I've got a great regional PR team ready to build your campaign the second you give the word." "I don't want regional." Marcus's voice sharpened. "I want the best in the country. I want Meridian Group." Trevor felt his stomach drop straight through the floor. Meridian Group was a name that carried weight in every boardroom in the country. They were the undisputed titan of brand strategy, working with Fortune 100 companies and household names, and they were famously, aggressively selective. They did not take cold calls from mid-tier wealth advisors operating out of a Dallas strip mall. "Marcus, listen." Trevor loosened his tie, his voice climbing an octave. "Meridian is notoriously private. They only take clients through internal referral. It's practically impossible to get in front of them cold." That's not my problem. That's your job. Marcus's tone went cold. You get me a meeting with Meridian Group by the end of next week, or I'm moving my entire portfolio to a firm that can actually open doors. My mother's friend already put me in touch with 2 firms in New York that say they can make it happen. The line went dead. Trevor sat frozen for a long moment before hurling his phone across the room. It cracked against the drywall and left a dent. He was days away from losing the only client capable of pulling him out of the hole he dug for himself. A hole built on predatory loans he'd never told Paige, let alone her parents, anything about. He grabbed the office landline and dialed the general number for Meridian Group's Manhattan headquarters, his mind racing through every angle, every possible favor he could call in, every assistant he might be able to flatter his way past. The call connected. A crisp, unbothered voice answered. Meridian Group corporate offices, how may I direct your call? Hi, yes. Trevor poured every last ounce of charm he had left into his voice. This is Trevor Sinclair. I represent a major fintech founder, and I need to speak with someone in brand partnerships, or ideally, directly with the CEO. I'm sorry, Mr. Sinclair, the voice replied, perfectly pleasant and utterly immovable. Our partnerships division does not accept unsolicited representation requests, and our chief executive does not take external calls. Then give me a name, an email, anything. The identity of our chief executive is confidential and not available to the public. You're welcome to submit a general inquiry through our website. Have a wonderful day. The line clicked dead. Trevor slammed the receiver down, again and again, until his palm ached. He was completely locked out, standing on the wrong side of a wall he had no idea I had personally built, brick by brick, over 11 years. For one brief, fleeting second, he thought of me. I had worked in marketing for over a decade. Maybe I knew someone. Maybe I had a contact somewhere in that world. And then he remembered with a small wince that he had stood at that dinner table and told me family should work like his client roster, that he had watched my sister drag my suitcases to the curb without lifting a single finger to stop her. He groaned and dropped his head into his hands, entirely unaware that the very woman he had helped cast out into the rain held every single key to the door he was pounding on. While Trevor was pounding uselessly against a locked door in Dallas, my parents were sitting at the same mahogany dining table where they had banished me weeks earlier, though the mood in that house had shifted from smug to something far closer to panic. Paige had spent the entire morning crying on the living room sofa because her bank had officially declined her latest mortgage payment. Her grace period had run out, and the first formal notice of default had arrived in a plain envelope that made her hands shake when she opened it. Trevor had quietly stopped contributing to the household grocery fund 2 weeks earlier, claiming cash flow issues he refused to explain in any real detail. And my parents, who had spent 30 years building a life on the appearance of money rather than the substance of it, discovered very quickly just how much of that appearance had been quietly financed by me. Without my contributions, the second mortgage payment on the Highland Park house, the one I had actually paid off years earlier without ever telling them, resurfaced as a problem because my father, never one to leave well enough alone, had taken out a home equity line of credit against the house 6 months earlier to help cover Paige's penthouse deposit. He hadn't told my mother the full amount. He certainly hadn't told me, back when I still lived under that roof, and might have warned him what a catastrophic idea it was. The equity line had a floating interest rate. Rates had climbed twice that year. What had once been a manageable monthly payment had ballooned into something my father could no longer make on his own income, not without the quiet cushion of money I used to wire into the household account every month without complaint or credit. We just need a temporary bridge, my father kept telling my mother, pacing the length of the dining room with his phone pressed to his ear, trying every private banking contact he had cultivated over 3 decades of country club small talk. Something to get us through the next 2 quarters. Nobody was willing to lend to him. His credit had taken a hit from carrying too much debt across too many fronts. The equity line, Paige's failed penthouse, Trevor's business loans that had somehow, disastrously, ended up co-signed by my father without my mother's knowledge. The Cole family, for all its outward polish, was quietly, catastrophically over-leveraged. And the one person who had spent over a decade holding it all together with invisible thread was gone. Back in California, Paige's Malibu deal was progressing exactly as she'd hoped, which is to say, exactly as I'd allowed it to. She flew out for what she believed was a private showing, arranged through the mysterious asset management firm handling the listing. In reality, the showing had been arranged by my head of household staff, a sharp, discreet woman named Renata, who had worked for me for 6 years and knew precisely who owned the property and precisely who was scheduled to walk through its front door that afternoon. Paige arrived in a rented convertible, sunglasses pushed up into her hair, practically vibrating with excitement as she stepped through the front gate. She snapped photos of the infinity pool for her social media before she'd even gotten through the front door, captioning one, "Closing the deal of a lifetime," tagging her broker's office for good measure. Renata greeted her at the door, polite and entirely unreadable. "Welcome. The owner asked that I show you through the property personally today." "Perfect," Paige said breezily, stepping past her into the foyer. "I have a client who's very interested, a defensive tackle heading into his rookie contract, and I think this place could be exactly the kind of statement property he's looking for." Renata gave a small, neutral nod and led her through the house. Paige ran her manicured fingers along the kitchen island, admired the wine cellar, stood in the primary suite snapping photo after photo, entirely oblivious to the framed photograph sitting on the nightstand of me at my own headquarters ribbon cutting, a photograph Renata had quietly turned face down that morning, just in case. It was in the study, admiring the built-in shelving, that Paige finally paused in front of a small brass plaque mounted discreetly beside the desk, the kind of thing a decorator might mistake for an architectural detail. It read, "Meridian Group Holdings, Private Residence, Estation Registration on File." "What's this?" Paige asked, tilting her head. "Just a formality for the county," Renata said smoothly. "The property is held under one of the ownership group's holding entities." Paige nodded, satisfied, filing it away as nothing more than boring paperwork, and moved on to photograph the ocean view from the study window, entirely unaware that she was standing 4 feet from evidence that would have ended her entire fantasy on the spot. If only she had bothered to actually read it. Let me tell you a little about what my actual life looked like during those weeks. Because while my family was quietly falling apart in Texas, I was doing exactly what I had spent 11 years building toward. Meridian Group's Manhattan headquarters occupied 18 floors of a glass tower in Midtown, and for the first time in over a decade, I walked through the lobby without pretending to be anyone other than exactly who I was. My executive assistant, a sharp, unflappable man named Julian, who had been with me since the earliest days of the company, had finally stopped calling me ma'am in that careful, distant tone he'd used while my identity was still a closely guarded secret even within my own walls, and started simply calling me Vanessa, the way you talk to someone you've actually watched build something real. The Marcus Webb account, the very same fintech founder Trevor was so desperately chasing, had actually crossed my desk 2 weeks before that infamous dinner. My acquisitions team had flagged his company as a rising force in the fintech space, the kind of client relationship worth cultivating early, before every other firm in the country started circling. I had personally reviewed the pitch deck. I had personally approved the outreach. By the time Marcus told Trevor he wanted Meridian Group or nothing at all, My team had already been in private, high-level talks with his board for nearly a month. Quietly, the way we did almost everything. Marcus had no idea, of course, that his floundering wealth advisor back in Dallas was married into the same family I'd walked away from weeks earlier. It was simply one of those strange, tightly wound coincidences that the world occasionally hands you. The kind you couldn't have planned even if you'd tried, and the kind I fully intended to let play out exactly as it wanted to. I closed the web account personally on a Thursday afternoon, shaking hands across a conference table with a man who had no reason to know that his own wealth manager was, at that very moment, 300 miles away, dialing my company's front desk for the fourth time that week and getting nowhere. There is a particular kind of quiet satisfaction in watching a door stay shut on someone who once slammed one on you, especially when they don't even know it's the same door. Back in Dallas, Trevor's situation had gone from bad to genuinely desperate. He'd burned through every favor he could think of, called 3 former colleagues who'd left the industry years ago, even reached out to a fraternity brother who claimed, loosely, to know someone who used to intern at Meridian Group a decade earlier. None of it produced anything but polite dead ends. The fraternity brother's contact hadn't worked there in 6 years and had no idea who currently ran the place because, as far as public record was concerned, nobody did. Marcus's deadline arrived on a Thursday evening, and Trevor spent the entire day rehearsing a speech he never got the chance to give. Marcus called at exactly 5 o'clock. "I gave you a full week," Marcus said, his voice devoid of the friendliness it once carried. "You told me you could make it happen, did you?" Trevor swallowed hard. "I'm still working every angle, Marcus. These things take time, especially with a firm as selective as, I already signed with someone else." Marcus cut him off flatly. "Turns out Meridian Group already had my company under review. Been talking to them for a month. Signed the partnership agreement this morning. I appreciate everything you've done for the portfolio, Trevor, but I'm moving my full account to a firm that can actually keep up with where I'm headed. My team will be in touch about the transfer paperwork." The line went dead before Trevor could say another word. He sat in his cramped, overheated office, staring at a blank laptop screen, and understood, with a sick, sinking clarity, that he had just lost the one client capable of saving him, to the exact same firm he'd spent a week failing to even get on the phone with. He didn't tell Paige that night. He didn't tell anyone. He simply sat in his car in the strip mall parking lot for 45 minutes after everyone else had gone home, staring at the dashboard, doing math that refused to add up no matter how many times he ran it. 2 days later, Paige's deal collapsed too, though hers went down in a far more public, far more humiliating fashion. The athlete client she'd been dangling in front of her broker turned out to be a name she'd essentially invented out of a half-remembered conversation with Trevor months earlier. A prospect who had never actually agreed to anything, who in fact had already signed a lease on a different property entirely, through a completely different agency, 2 weeks before Paige ever set foot in Malibu. When Georgia asked for updated paperwork, a signed letter of intent, anything at all to justify the commission Paige had already mentally spent 3 times over, Paige had nothing to show her but a folder of iPhone photos and a story that fell apart the second anyone asked a direct question. "You told me you had a client," Georgia said, her voice flat with a fury that had clearly been building for months. "You told this office you had a real buyer for a 9-figure property owned by a client we cannot afford to embarrass. Do you understand what you've done?" "I was working on it," Paige stammered. "The deal just needs a little more time to—" "You're done here, Paige." Georgia didn't even raise her voice. "Clean out your desk by Friday. I'll be filing a formal complaint with the board regarding the misrepresentation, which means you can expect a call about your license sooner rather than later." Paige drove home from that meeting in complete silence, her hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel, arriving at her parents' house just as Trevor pulled into the driveway from the opposite direction, both of them wearing the exact same hollow, shell-shocked expression, though neither of them yet knew the other had just lost everything on the very same day. By the time April rolled around, the Cole family had gone from a household quietly propped up by a daughter they despised to a household in genuine freefall. And nobody inside that house had the first idea how to stop the slide. Paige moved back into her childhood bedroom exactly the way she'd promised the family she never would, dragging designer luggage up the same staircase she'd once watched me carry my own bags down. Trevor followed 2 weeks later, once it became clear neither of them could make rent on the penthouse a single month longer. My old room, the one my mother had promised to turn into a nursery, sat instead as a storage closet for boxes of unsold designer shoes and unopened wedding china, because there was, as it turned out, no baby, no nursery, no bright future waiting on the other side of my absence. There was only a smaller, more crowded version of the same house, minus the one person who had quietly kept it running. My father spent his mornings on the phone with the bank, his voice growing thinner and more desperate with every call. The home equity line had ballooned past what the house was even worth in the current market, a market that had cooled considerably since he'd taken the loan out. My mother had started selling pieces of her jewelry on consignment, quietly, without telling anyone, slipping out to a discreet shop in a strip mall 2 towns over so none of her country club friends would spot her car in the lot. Dinner conversations, once filled with bragging about commissions and clients, had turned into something closer to a war room. Voices raised over who had spent what, who had promised what, who was to blame for the mess none of them would admit they'd built entirely on their own, without me, and honestly, in large part because of decisions I'd had absolutely nothing to do with. If Vanessa hadn't gotten herself fired, none of this would be happening, my mother said one night, as if that logic made any sense at all, as if my supposed unemployment had somehow caused my father to take out a predatory loan against his own house, or Trevor to bury himself in business debt he'd hidden from his own wife. "She did this to us," Paige agreed bitterly, though even she seemed to understand, on some level, how thin that argument had worn. "She probably planned it. Getting fired right before everything fell apart. Real convenient timing." Nobody in that house ever considered calling me. Pride, or something close to it, kept every one of them from picking up the phone and admitting they needed help from the daughter they'd thrown out in the rain. It would have meant admitting they'd been wrong, and admitting they'd been wrong was simply not a language anyone in that household had ever learned to speak. The default notice on the house arrived in early May. My father sat at the kitchen table reading it 3 times, as if a 4th reading might change the numbers printed on the page. The lender had transferred the note. The original bank, apparently eager to offload a growing pile of underperforming loans from its books, had sold a bundle of distressed debt, including my parents' equity line, to a private buyer at a steep discount. That private buyer was a boutique asset management firm called Vanguard Holdings, a wholly owned subsidiary of Meridian Group Capital, which was, in turn, a wholly owned subsidiary of the company I had spent 11 years quietly building. I had not gone looking for my parents' debt. I want to be honest about that. I did not sit in my office plotting to buy up my own family's mortgage out of some elaborate revenge fantasy. What actually happened was far simpler and, in its own way, far colder. My acquisitions team ran automated algorithms across distressed debt pools every single week, hunting for undervalued assets, the same way we did for every corner of the business. One of those algorithms flagged a bundle of Texas home equity loans trading at a steep discount due to rising default risk. My analyst pulled the file, ran the numbers, and brought it to me in a routine Tuesday meeting, one folder among a dozen others that week. I recognized the address before I even finished reading the borrower name. I sat with that folder open in front of me for a long time after my analyst left the room. I could have passed on it. There were 100 other distressed debt pools we could have bought instead. Cleaner, less complicated, entirely unconnected to a family that had once made me feel small in my own childhood home. But I thought about the 2 brown suitcases sitting on the floor of my old bedroom. I thought about 60 minutes in the freezing rain, and I signed the acquisition. I did not do it to save them. I want that understood clearly. I did it because I wanted to hold the paper. I wanted, for the first time in my entire life, to be the one person in that family's story who actually held the power, instead of the one person who had always, quietly, absorbed the cost of everyone else's decisions. My father had no idea, of course, that the letter now sitting on his kitchen table, informing him his loan had been sold to an entity called Vanguard Holdings, had anything at all to do with me. Vanguard was one of 11 subsidiaries operating under a corporate structure so deliberately layered that even seasoned financial journalists had never successfully traced it back to a single named owner. As far as my father was concerned, Vanguard Holdings was simply another faceless institution, another corporate machine he'd have to beg for mercy from. He called the number listed on the letter that same afternoon, his voice tight with the particular kind of desperation that only comes from a man who has never once had to ask anyone for anything. "I need to speak with someone about restructuring this loan," he told the representative who answered. "We're facing some temporary financial difficulty, and I'd like to discuss options before this moves any further toward foreclosure." "I understand, sir," the representative said smoothly. "Vanguard Holdings does offer a formal review process for loans in early default. Given the size of this account, it would need to be handled directly by our asset management division. I can schedule you for an in-person consultation at our regional office." My father agreed immediately, relief flooding his voice, entirely unaware that the regional office in question sat on the 40th floor of a glass tower in Manhattan, and that the person ultimately responsible for approving or denying his request for mercy was the same daughter he'd once told, without a shred of hesitation, that she had exactly 60 minutes to get off his property. The consultation was scheduled for the following Thursday. My father told my mother they were flying to New York for what he described, with a kind of forced optimism nobody in that house actually believed, as a routine meeting to sort things out. Paige, hearing about the trip, insisted on coming along, some vague, half-formed idea rattling around her head about networking her way into a fresh start in a new city, a new market. Somewhere nobody yet knew her name had already been quietly blacklisted from every brokerage in Dallas. Trevor came too, mostly because he had nowhere else to be, and nothing left to lose by tagging along. None of them told me they were coming because none of them had any idea I was the one they were coming to see. I should tell you what those 11 years actually cost me, because from the outside it probably sounds like a fairy tale. Quiet girl secretly builds a billion-dollar empire, waits patiently, gets her revenge. It wasn't like that. Not even close. I graduated business school with more debt than most of my classmates because I'd taken out loans instead of letting my parents co-sign anything. A decision I made deliberately at 22 years old because I already understood, even then, that owing my family money would mean owing them my entire life. I took the job at Halloway and Reed because it paid enough to cover rent on a studio apartment I could barely afford, and student loan payments that ate nearly a third of my paycheck. I worked there from 8:45 to 6 every single day, and then I went home, ate dinner standing over my kitchen sink because I hadn't bought a table yet, and opened my second laptop to work on Meridian Group until 1 or 2 in the morning. For the first 3 years, Meridian Group made almost nothing. I took on any client who would have me. Small local businesses that couldn't afford the big agencies, a family-owned bakery, a struggling law firm, a boutique fitness studio that paid me partly in free classes because they couldn't cover my full rate. I built their websites, wrote their marketing copy, designed their branding, and slowly, client by client, built a reputation as someone who actually delivered results instead of just decks full of buzzwords. I moved back into my parents' house during that stretch, not because I couldn't afford my own apartment, but because I needed every spare dollar to reinvest into Meridian Group, and living rent-free, even under the weight of my family's constant criticism, was the fastest way to accelerate my timeline. I told them I'd lost my apartment lease. I told them my roommate had moved out unexpectedly. I told them whatever small, boring lie kept them from asking too many questions. Because the truth? That I was quietly building something that would one day dwarf every ounce of wealth my father had ever pretended to have, was not a truth I was ready to hand them. Not yet. Maybe not ever. There was a stretch during year 4 when I genuinely wondered if I'd made a terrible mistake. A key client backed out on a 6-figure contract 2 weeks before I was set to invoice, and I had to lay off the 2 freelance designers I'd finally been able to afford to bring on. I sat in my car in the parking lot of Halloway and Reed on my lunch break and cried for the first time in longer than I could remember. Not because I was sad, exactly, but because I was so tired of carrying 2 entire lives on my shoulders, with nobody in my corner who knew either of them fully. The one person who did know was a woman named Priya Anand, my college roommate and, to this day, the only person outside my company who has ever fully understood what I was building. Priya had gone into corporate law after graduation, and she'd handled every early legal filing for Meridian Group for a fraction of her normal rate, sometimes for nothing at all, sitting across from me at her kitchen table, drafting incorporation documents at midnight, because it was the only time either of us had free. "You're going to look back on this someday," Priya told me during that low point in year 4, "and none of it is going to feel as hard as it does right now. I promise you that." She was right, though it would take another 2 years before I'd fully believe it. The Halloway and Reed acquisition, the one that finally let me walk away from both lives and merge into one, took 6 years of careful, patient work. I bought shares slowly, through Priya's firm, through a private holding entity registered under a maiden name so distant from my own that no journalist, no board member, no curious coworker ever connected the dots. I watched the company's corrupt leadership from the inside the entire time, sitting in low-level meetings, taking notes nobody thought mattered, quietly documenting years of self-dealing contracts the board had funneled to their own shell companies. Evidence I eventually used to force a full leadership overhaul the moment my holding company crossed 51%. The night that acquisition finally closed, I sat alone in my studio apartment, the same one I'd kept the entire time as a kind of anchor, a reminder of where I'd started. And I didn't celebrate the way you might expect. I just sat quietly on the floor with a glass of wine and cried again. Differently this time. The kind of crying that comes from finally setting down something impossibly heavy after carrying it for 6 straight years. 3 days later, I sat at my parents' dinner table and watched my phone light up with the termination notice that would send my family into a screaming panic. A notice that, to them, meant disaster, and to me, meant I had finally, quietly, become exactly who I'd always secretly known I could be. The flight to New York was, according to what I later heard from Renata, who had quietly arranged the entire visit on my behalf without my family ever realizing it, a tense, silent affair. My father sat rigid in his coach seat, reviewing a folder of financial documents he'd printed at a library because he could no longer afford the printer ink at home. My mother stared out the window, twisting the one ring she hadn't yet sold. Paige spent most of the flight scrolling job listings on her phone with a kind of desperate, unfocused energy, occasionally showing Trevor a listing for a marketing coordinator position that paid a fraction of what she'd need to survive. Trevor stared straight ahead for most of the 3.5 hours, saying almost nothing, still carrying the private, unspoken weight of the Marcus Webb account he'd lost and never told anyone about. They checked into a mid-range hotel near Times Square, the kind of place my father would have once turned his nose up at, and spent the evening rehearsing what they'd say to the loan officer the next morning, though none of them had the faintest idea they'd be walking into anything more complicated than a standard financial hardship meeting. "We stay calm," my father said, pacing the small hotel room. "We stay professional. We explain the temporary nature of the hardship, and we ask for a modification. 6 months of reduced payments, maybe a year. That's all we need." "What if they say no?" my mother asked quietly. "They won't say no." My father said it with more confidence than he actually felt. "These firms restructure loans all the time. It's better for them than foreclosing. Nobody wants to actually take the house." Paige, sitting cross-legged on the edge of the second bed, looked up from her phone. "Maybe I should come in with you. I could talk about the market, show I understand real estate from a professional angle. It might help our case." "You lost your license 2 weeks ago," Trevor said flatly, the first real sentence he'd spoken in hours. "I did not lose it. It's under review." "Same thing." "Enough." My mother's voice cracked with exhaustion. "We are all going in together tomorrow. This affects this entire family, and we present as a family. United." Nobody in that hotel room slept particularly well that night, though for very different reasons than the ones waiting for them the next morning. The Meridian Group Tower sat on a corner in Midtown, 60 stories of dark glass catching the morning light. The kind of building that made people instinctively lower their voices the moment they stepped through the revolving doors. My family arrived 20 minutes early, dressed in the nicest clothes they'd brought, my father in a suit that had fit him better 3 years earlier, my mother in a modest dress and the last piece of jewelry she hadn't yet sold, a small pearl brooch that had belonged to her own mother. The lobby alone seemed to knock some of the confidence out of my father's posture. Soaring ceilings, a wall of water cascading behind the reception desk, a security team dressed more formally than most of the executives my father had ever worked alongside. He gave the receptionist the name of the appointment, Cole, scheduled with the Vanguard Holdings Asset Management Division, and she checked a screen, nodded politely, and directed them to a bank of elevators reserved for scheduled visitors. 40th floor, she said. "Someone will meet you when the doors open." The elevator ride was silent, except for the quiet hum of the mechanism and the faint, tinny sound of instrumental music piped through hidden speakers. Paige studied her reflection in the polished steel doors, smoothing her hair, rehearsing a professional smile she hadn't had much use for in weeks. Trevor stood with his hands clasped in front of him, staring at the floor numbers ticking upward. My mother reached over at one point and took my father's hand, a gesture I'm told she hadn't made in public in years. The doors opened onto a wide reception area with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the whole of Midtown, a view expensive enough to make my father's stomach tighten with a fresh wave of nerves. A young woman in a sharp black blazer greeted them, introducing herself as an assistant to the Asset Management Division, and led them down a long hallway lined with framed magazine covers, business publications my father recognized instantly, each one featuring some version of the same headline. The reclusive founder behind Meridian Group's meteoric rise, always described, always speculated about, and never, not once, photographed or named. Whose office is this division? My father asked, trying and failing to sound casual. You'll be meeting with our head of special asset acquisitions today, the assistant said smoothly, giving nothing away. If you'll wait here, she'll be with you shortly. She led them into a glass-walled conference room and closed the door behind her. My family sat down around a long table made of pale, polished stone. My father at the head, out of habit. My mother beside him. Paige and Trevor across from each other. All four of them glancing nervously at the framed magazine covers visible through the glass wall behind them. At the sheer, silent scale of the buildings surrounding them. At a level of wealth none of them had ever stood this close to before. This is a bigger operation than I expected, my mother whispered. It's just a subsidiary, my father said, though his voice had lost most of its earlier confidence. A regional office. We'll be fine. They had absolutely no idea they were sitting 40 floors beneath the corner office where I spent most of my mornings. No idea that the woman scheduled to walk through that glass door in a matter of minutes had once carried 2 brown suitcases down their staircase in the freezing rain, while all 4 of them watched from the bottom of the stairs, without lifting a single finger to help her. I let them sit in that conference room for 11 minutes. Not because I needed the time. My schedule that morning was, in fact, entirely clear, because I had cleared it 3 days earlier the moment Renata confirmed my father's appointment had gone through under the Vanguard Holdings intake system. I let them sit there because I wanted them to feel exactly what I had felt 1,000 times over the years, sitting at their dinner table waiting for someone to acknowledge that I mattered, waiting for someone to notice me at all. At exactly 10 minutes past the hour, I walked down the long hallway lined with those framed magazine covers, past the assistant who gave me a small, knowing nod, and stopped outside the glass conference room door. Through the glass, I watched my father check his watch for the 3rd time, watched my mother smooth the same wrinkle out of her dress over and over, watched Paige whisper something sharp to Trevor that made his jaw tighten. I took a breath and I opened the door. The reaction was immediate and total. My mother's hand flew to her mouth. My father half rose out of his chair before some instinct told him to sit back down. Paige's face went through an entire sequence of expressions in the space of 2 seconds: confusion, disbelief, and finally, something close to horror. Trevor simply stared, his mouth slightly open, clearly trying and failing to make the math work in his head. I walked to the head of the table and set down a thick red folder, the smack of it against the stone surface echoing sharply through the silent room. Nobody said a word. I unclasped the folder and spread the documents across the table, deliberately, unhurried. They were the original, fully executed mortgage and equity line documents for the Highland Park house, along with the transfer paperwork showing the loan sale from the original bank to Vanguard Holdings, and beneath that, the ownership chain connecting Vanguard Holdings all the way up to Meridian Group. "What are you doing here, Vanessa?" my father finally managed, his voice barely above a whisper. His eyes darted past me toward the open door, as if he expected the actual head of asset acquisitions to walk in any second and explain that this was all some kind of mistake. "Where is the woman who's supposed to be handling our account?" he asked. I placed my index finger on the top document, right beside the bold Vanguard Holdings letterhead. Vanguard Holdings is a subsidiary asset management arm, I said, my voice level and cold. It's wholly owned and operated by Meridian Group, and as of 3 days ago, you already met the CEO of Meridian Group. You just didn't recognize her, because you spent 36 years never actually looking at her closely enough to notice. My father stumbled back a step, hitting the glass wall behind him, his eyes darting from my face to the folder and back again, over and over, as if repetition might change what was written on the page. When my acquisitions team flagged this property entering pre-foreclosure status, I continued, holding his gaze without flinching, I didn't hesitate. I personally authorized the purchase of your outstanding debt from the bank at a discounted rate. I didn't do it to save you. I did it because I wanted to hold the paper that proves I own the exact roof you once told me I no longer had a right to sleep under. I am your sole creditor now. I am the reason your house still has a roof at all. And I am also the reason that roof is currently in serious jeopardy. You planned this. My mother's voice cracked, tears already spilling down her face, ruining the careful makeup she'd applied that morning. You orchestrated this whole thing to destroy us. I didn't orchestrate anything, I said. I didn't force Trevor into predatory business loans he never disclosed to his own wife. I didn't force Dad to take out an equity line against a house I had already paid off once, without ever telling him, because I didn't need the credit and I didn't need the gratitude. I didn't force Paige to lie to her broker about a client who never existed. I simply bought the outcome that was already coming for all of you, months before I ever showed up in this room. We're your parents, Vanessa. My mother's voice broke into something close to a sob. You cannot do this to us. You came here today, I said, my voice quiet but absolutely steady, to beg a faceless corporation for a loan modification. You came here to ask strangers for the exact mercy none of you were willing to show me the night you dragged 2 suitcases out of a hall closet and gave me 60 minutes to disappear from your lives. I let the silence sit for a moment, watching the full weight of it settle over their faces. There is no modification, I said. There is no grace period. You have exactly 24 hours to pack your lives and surrender your keys. Paige finally found her voice, thin and shaking. You can't just throw us out. That's illegal. There are laws. There are procedures. You can't just... I have every legal right to enforce the terms of a defaulted loan I now hold, I said, cutting her off without raising my voice. You'd know that, Paige, if you'd ever actually closed a real estate transaction instead of inventing fake buyers to save face in front of your broker. Paige's face went white. She hadn't told anyone in the family the real reason she'd lost her license. You lost your license, I said, watching the realization hit her that I already knew. Because you fabricated a client to a firm that trusted you, the exact same way you fabricated an entire personality to this family for 31 years. And Trevor? I turned to him, watching him flinch before I even finished the sentence. You lost the Marcus Webb account 2 days before that call, didn't you? The one you never told Paige about, because admitting it meant admitting you'd failed at the one thing keeping your marriage financially afloat. Trevor's face drained of color entirely. How could you possibly know that? Marcus Webb signed with Meridian Group, I said simply. I closed that account myself, 2 weeks before you ever picked up the phone to try and reach us. You were competing against me the entire time, and you never even knew it. The room fell into a silence so heavy it felt like it had weight, like it was pressing down on all 4 of their shoulders at once. Actually, I said, straightening, 24 hours is far too generous. It doesn't align with the standard you all set for this family the last time somebody needed to be out of a house on short notice. I reached down beside my chair and lifted 2 objects up onto the polished stone table, pushing them forward until they slid to a stop directly in front of my father's trembling hands. They were 2 battered, faded brown suitcases, the zippers slightly frayed, the fabric worn thin at the corners. The exact same bags my mother had dragged out of the hall closet and dropped at my feet months earlier. I had kept them. I had instructed Renata to retrieve them from the storage unit where I'd left them and ship them to my office for this exact moment. "You gave me these when you threw me out into the rain," I said, my tone entirely devoid of anger now, flat and factual. "You told me I needed tough love. You told me you weren't running a charity. You told me that putting me out on the street with nothing was the exact motivation I needed to finally get my life together." I leaned forward slightly, resting my hands on the folder. "So consider this my gift back to you, George. I'm simply returning the philosophy you handed me." My mother let out a long, broken sound, reaching out to touch the frayed handle of one of the suitcases, as though she couldn't quite believe it was real. "How are we supposed to fit an entire life into 2 bags?" she whispered. "That's a logistical question for whoever you hire to help you move," I said. "Though I imagine Trevor is a little too busy right now to be much help." I stood, straightening my blazer, feeling the weight of 36 years of their opinions of me lift off my shoulders in one long, clean breath. I didn't feel the need to shout. I didn't feel the need to demand an apology I already knew, deep down, I was never going to get. Their financial ruin, entirely self-inflicted, was the only apology I would ever need from any of them. "The house belongs to me now," I said, glancing down at the watch on my wrist. "I have a demolition crew scheduled to clear the lot Monday morning to make way for new development. I'm erasing that house from the map entirely. You'll leave your keys on the counter. You'll take only what fits in those 2 bags. Everything else belongs to Vanguard Holdings, effective immediately." My father stared at me, his eyes empty, finally understanding there was no negotiation left to find, no wealthy friend from the club who could bail him out, no version of this story where he still held any power over the daughter he had spent a lifetime underestimating. "Please," he whispered, the word breaking apart in his throat. "You have 60 minutes to gather what you can carry," I said, delivering back the exact sentence he'd once handed me. "Your 60 minutes starts now." I didn't wait for an answer. I didn't want to watch any of them cry. I turned, picked up my briefcase, and walked out through the glass door into the bright, humming reception area of my own company. Phones ringing somewhere down the hall. Deals closing in offices I'd built with my own 2 hands. Security nodding respectfully as I passed. I walked the length of the marble corridor without turning around once, pressed the call button for my private elevator, and stepped inside as the silver doors slid shut. Through the long glass hallway, just before the doors closed completely, I caught one last glimpse of the conference room in the distance. My parents were slumped over the stone table, clutching 2 brown suitcases, my mother sobbing into my father's shoulder, Paige staring blankly at the wall, Trevor with his head in his hands. The elevator doors slid shut, cutting off the sight entirely, and I felt the car begin its smooth, silent descent, carrying me down and out into the bright, wide-open version of the life I had spent 11 years quietly building for myself. I want to tell you what happened after, because I think the aftermath matters just as much as the reveal itself, maybe more. The Highland Park house sold at a steep discount 11 days later, not to a developer in the end, but to a young family relocating from Chicago who had no idea about any of the history buried inside those walls. I let the demolition threat stand exactly long enough to make my point in that conference room, and then I quietly reversed the order the following Monday morning, not out of mercy toward my parents, but because destroying a perfectly good house felt like an act of waste I didn't actually need to commit. I had already taken what I needed from that threat. I didn't need to follow through on the rebel. My parents moved into a modest 2-bedroom rental 40 minutes outside the city, a world away from the country club and the leased Range Rover and the version of themselves they'd spent 3 decades performing for the neighbors. My father, at 61 years old, took a job managing inventory at a hardware store. The first job he'd held that didn't come with a title attached to it since before I was born. My mother sold the last of her jewelry within the first month and picked up part-time work at a local boutique, folding clothes for customers a fraction of her former social standing, a job she never once complained about within earshot of me, though I heard, secondhand, that she cried in the car after her first shift. Paige and Trevor's marriage did not survive the fallout. Without the shared fiction of success to paper over the cracks, they discovered they had very little left holding them together. Trevor's business loans caught up with him in full within the year, a bankruptcy filing that closed his advisory practice entirely and forced him to take a job cold calling for a call center that sold extended car warranties, a long, humiliating distance from custom Italian suits and 9-figure fintech founders. Paige, unable to work in real estate anywhere in the state after her license review concluded, eventually took a job at a department store cosmetics counter, the kind of job she once would have considered beneath her, the kind of job she now clocks into 6 days a week without a single ounce of the golden child confidence she used to wear like armor. I didn't do any of that to them directly. I want to be clear about that. I didn't sabotage Trevor's loans or call Paige's broker to report her. Their choices did that. The same choices they've been making for years while I quietly covered the gap those choices left behind. I simply stopped covering it, and the whole fragile structure they'd built on top of my invisible labor collapsed under its own weight the moment I stepped out from underneath it. Priya, my old college roommate turned corporate lawyer, still handles Meridian Group's most sensitive legal work to this day, and she's the closest thing I have to family in the traditional sense. We spend most holidays together now, her family folding me into their Thanksgiving table without a second thought, the way people do when love isn't conditional on what you can provide. I never spoke to my parents again after that morning in the conference room, not out of cruelty, and not out of some dramatic permanent vow of silence. I simply never found a reason to. They never called to apologize, not once in the 2 years since, and I stopped waiting for a call that was never going to come, sometime around the 6-month mark. Paige reached out exactly once, a text message late one night that read simply, "I hope you're happy," which felt less like an olive branch and more like the last gasp of someone who still, even then, believed I owed her something. I didn't respond. I want to go back for a moment to the actual mechanics of the Halloway and Reed takeover, because people always ask me how something like that actually happens, quietly, over years, without anyone noticing. The corrupt leadership at Halloway and Reed centered around 3 people. The CEO, a smooth, silver-haired man named Douglas Pratt, who had run the firm for 19 years, the chief financial officer, a woman named Barbara Ellsworth, who had been quietly funneling consulting contracts to her brother-in-law's shell company for the better part of a decade, and the chairman of the board, an aging investor named Walter Kim, who had long since stopped paying attention to anything beyond his own dividend checks. Together, the 3 of them had turned a once-respected mid-sized agency into a hollowed-out shell, still profitable on paper, but bleeding real value into their own pockets year after year. I noticed the pattern within my first 18 months at the company, back when I was still just an entry-level marketing assistant nobody paid much attention to. invoices for consulting work that never seemed to produce any actual consulting. Vendor contracts awarded without competitive bids to companies with addresses that traced back, if you looked closely enough, to relatives of the executive team. I kept quiet notes on all of it in a private encrypted file, not because I had a plan yet, but because some instinct told me the information might matter someday. By year 3, I had a plan. I approached Priya, freshly out of law school and hungry for real work, with an idea that probably sounded insane the first time I said it out loud. I wanted to slowly, quietly, legally acquire enough shares in Halloway & Reed to force a leadership change. And I wanted to do it without anyone at the company, especially my own family, ever knowing it was me. "Do you understand how long that would take?" Priya asked me, sitting across her kitchen table with a legal pad covered in her cramped, precise handwriting. "You're talking about years of quiet accumulation, filing under a holding entity, staying under every disclosure threshold that would trigger a mandatory public announcement. This isn't a weekend project, Vanessa." "I have years," I told her. "That's the one thing I actually have plenty of." We built the structure carefully. A holding entity registered under my mother's maiden name, Whitfield, a name distant enough from Cole that no clerk, no journalist, no curious coworker would ever think to connect the two. I funneled every dollar of profit from Meridian Group's early client work into slow, careful share purchases, staying meticulously below the 5% threshold that would have required public disclosure. Buying through multiple intermediary accounts Priya structured with a precision that still impresses me to this day. The work itself, my actual day job, gave me a strange kind of cover. Nobody suspects the quiet marketing assistant who never gets promoted of secretly buying up the company from underneath the people who keep passing her over. I made myself entirely unremarkable on purpose. I turned down 2 promotions during those years, specifically because a higher title would have meant more scrutiny, more visibility, more risk that someone might eventually ask why an ambitious woman with an MBA seemed so strangely content sitting still. By year 5, my holding company had crossed 30% ownership, still quiet, still invisible to the board, who assumed the growing block of shares belonged to some disengaged institutional investor, content to collect dividends without asking questions. I used that 5th year to build my case. I compiled every fraudulent invoice, every no-bid contract, every quiet transfer of company funds into executive family pockets, into a single, meticulously documented file. The kind of file that could survive a courtroom, not just a boardroom argument. The moment came in the spring of my 6th year, 3 days before that dinner where my family threw me out into the rain. My holding company crossed 51% ownership with a final, carefully timed purchase of a large institutional block that had quietly come up for sale. The instant the transaction cleared, I exercised majority shareholder rights and called an emergency board meeting. I still remember walking into that boardroom for the first time, not as an invisible assistant, but as the majority owner of the entire company. Douglas Pratt's face when I introduced myself, when Priya laid out 18 months of documented fraud across the table in front of him, when the board's own outside counsel confirmed the numbers were airtight, is a memory I still turn over sometimes, quietly, on nights when I need reminding of exactly how far patience can carry you. "This is absurd," Douglas said, his voice climbing toward panic. "You're an entry-level marketing assistant. You've worked here, 6 years, and never once advanced past a junior role? This has to be some kind of mistake." "I never wanted to advance," I told him, sliding the ownership documentation across the table. Advancing would have meant someone paying attention to me, and I needed exactly the opposite for exactly as long as it took to get here. Barbara Ellsworth resigned within the week, ahead of the fraud referral Priya's firm was preparing to file with regulators. Walter Kim, the chairman, simply never showed up to another board meeting again, quietly liquidating his remaining shares and disappearing into a comfortable, disgraced retirement. Douglas Pratt fought harder, hiring an aggressive legal team to challenge the acquisition's legality, but 18 months of documented fraud left him almost nothing to stand on. He settled quietly 6 months later, in exchange for the company agreeing not to pursue criminal referral, and walked away with his reputation permanently, publicly damaged. I rebuilt the company from the ground up over the following months, scrubbing the Halloway and Reed name entirely, rebranding under the name I'd been quietly building in the shadows for 6 years. Meridian Group. I brought in a leadership team I'd personally vetted, people who had no idea I was the same quiet assistant who used to bring them coffee and meetings. People who simply knew me as the founder finally stepping forward into daylight. The termination notice that lit up my phone at my parents' dinner table wasn't corporate HR firing me. It was corporate HR formally closing the employee file of a woman who no longer existed in that building. Because the woman sitting at that dinner table, eating dry pot roast and absorbing insult after insult from people who claimed to love her, had just quietly become the sole owner of the entire company. People sometimes ask me why I let it go on for so long. Why I sat through years of being underestimated instead of simply telling my family the truth the moment Meridian Group started turning a real profit. The honest answer is complicated, but I'll try to explain it as clearly as I can because I think it matters for understanding everything that came after. There was a Christmas, back when I was 28, when my father stood up at the dinner table and toasted Paige for closing her very first real estate deal, a modest starter home that netted her a commission of about $11,000. He raised his glass and talked for nearly 5 minutes about ambition, about drive, about finally having a child in this family who understood what it meant to build something. I sat at the far end of the table, having just quietly closed a client contract worth 4 times that commission for Meridian Group that same week, and said nothing at all. Because saying something would have meant explaining a company none of them knew existed, and I wasn't ready yet. I smiled and clapped for my sister and went back to my apartment that night and worked until 2 a.m. on a pitch deck for a client 20 times the size of anything Paige had ever touched. There was a birthday, my 30th, that my mother forgot entirely, too consumed with helping Paige stage an open house that weekend. And when I mentioned it gently the following week, she laughed and said, "Oh, Vanessa, you've never been one for making a fuss. I figured you'd rather just let it pass quietly." As though my quietness had ever once been a choice about celebration and not a decade of careful, exhausting camouflage. There was a Thanksgiving when Trevor, freshly married into the family and already performing wealth he didn't have, asked me across the table in front of everyone what exactly I did for work again, because he could never quite remember. And when I told him I worked in marketing, he laughed. Not unkindly exactly, but with a dismissiveness that landed harder than he probably intended, and said, "Marketing, sure. Someone's got to do the little stuff, right? Not everyone can be a closer." I remember looking down at my plate and thinking about the 11-figure acquisition I was quietly assembling and saying nothing at all. Because the satisfaction of staying silent had, by that point, become its own strange private reward. There was the time my mother found out from a neighbor that I'd apparently been seen having lunch with a well-known venture capitalist at a restaurant near my office, and instead of asking me about it directly, she called to ask, with obvious suspicion, whether I was seeing someone important and trying to keep it a secret from the family. as if the only reason a powerful man might sit across a table from me was romantic interest, rather than the multi-million-dollar partnership deal we were actually negotiating. I collected these moments the way some people collect stamps, quietly, methodically, filing each one away as further proof that the decision I'd made to build my entire second life in total secrecy was the correct one. Every dismissive comment, every forgotten birthday, every moment my family looked straight through me toward whichever sibling or in-law was performing success more loudly that particular year, confirmed something I'd suspected since I was a teenager, that their love, such as it was, had always been conditional on visible achievement, on the kind of success you could brag about at a country club dinner. And I had simply decided, somewhere along the way, that I would rather build something real in silence than perform something fake for applause. That doesn't mean it didn't hurt. I want to be honest about that, too. There were nights, plenty of them, when I sat alone in my apartment after another dismissive family dinner and genuinely wondered what it would feel like to have people who saw me clearly, who valued the quiet, unglamorous, difficult work of actually building something instead of only celebrating the shiny, easy performance of having already arrived. Priya saw me. My small early team at Meridian Group saw me, eventually, once I let them. But my own family, the people whose approval I'd spent my entire childhood chasing, never once looked closely enough to notice. By the time I sat at that final dinner table, phone buzzing with the notification that would end everything, I had already made my peace with that particular grief. I wasn't angry anymore by the time Paige snatched my phone out of my hand. I was, if anything, almost curious to see exactly how far they'd go, exactly how cruel they'd allow themselves to be, now that they genuinely believed I had nothing left to offer them. They went further than even I expected, and in a strange way, I'm grateful for that, because it meant the ending, when it finally came, didn't require a single ounce of hesitation from me. Let me tell you what my life actually looks like now, because I think it matters just as much as the revenge. Maybe more, since revenge is really just the closing chapter of a story, and I'd rather spend more time telling you about the chapters that came after. I split my time between the Manhattan headquarters and the Malibu house, the same one Paige nearly leased out to a fictional football player without ever realizing whose bedroom she was standing in. Renata still runs that household with the same quiet efficiency she brought to that staged showing, and we've since become something closer to genuine friends than employer and staff, sharing a standing Sunday morning coffee ritual on the deck overlooking the water whenever I'm in town. Meridian Group has grown considerably since that first year of visible ownership. We now employ just over 4,000 people across 11 offices worldwide, and I've made it a personal priority, maybe an overcorrection, maybe not, to build a culture that actively rewards the quiet, unglamorous people who do the real work without ever demanding credit for it. Every year, we run an internal recognition program specifically designed to surface employees who never nominate themselves, who never angle for visibility. Because I understand better than most executives exactly how much value companies lose when they only reward the loudest people in the room. Julian, my executive assistant from the earliest days, now runs an entire division of the company, and I made him a full partner 2 years ago. A decision that surprised absolutely nobody who'd watched him work 18-hour days beside me during the roughest stretch of the takeover, without ever once asking for recognition he hadn't yet earned. I started dating again, cautiously, about a year after the conference room confrontation with my parents. His name is Marcus, though not the Marcus from the fintech deal, a different Marcus entirely. A marine biologist I met, of all places, at a fundraiser for ocean conservation that Meridian Group sponsors annually. He had no idea who I was when we first started talking. Genuinely, no idea. Because I'd introduced myself using nothing but my first name and let the conversation unfold entirely on its own terms for nearly 20 minutes before someone else at the event addressed me by my full title. He told me later that the moment he realized who I actually was, his first thought wasn't about the company or the money, but about how strange it felt that someone with that kind of scale to her life had spent 20 full minutes asking him detailed questions about coral reef restoration without once mentioning anything about herself. That, more than almost anything else, is how I've learned to recognize the difference between people who see me and people who see my balance sheet. My family only ever managed the second kind of seeing, and even then, only once the numbers finally became too large to ignore. I've also quietly funded a scholarship program through Meridian Group aimed specifically at first-generation business students who don't have family connections or seed capital to fall back on, the kind of support I desperately could have used during those exhausting early years, building a second life out of a studio apartment kitchen. We've funded over 300 students so far, and I make a point of personally reading every application essay myself, because I remember vividly what it felt like to build something entirely alone, without a single person cheering from the sidelines. None of this, I should say clearly, erases what happened at that dinner table, or what happened in that conference room months later. I'm not interested in pretending my story ends with some tidy redemption arc where I forgive everyone and we all sit down for a peaceful holiday dinner. That's not what happened. And I don't think it needed to happen for me to move forward with my life. Some relationships simply end permanently. And the healthiest thing you can do sometimes is let them stay ended, instead of forcing a reconciliation nobody involved has actually earned. I never actually told you what happened in the hours right after I walked out of my parents' house that night, soaked through, dragging 2 suitcases down a dark, rain-slicked street toward the corner where I'd called a car. And I think it's worth going back to, because it's the part of the story people relate to most when I tell it in person. I sat in the back of that car with my wet hair plastered to my face, watching the windshield wipers cut through the downpour. And for about 4 minutes, somewhere between my parents' driveway and the highway on-ramp, I let myself feel the full weight of it. Not the corporate triumph, not the quiet satisfaction of knowing the termination notice meant something entirely different than what my family assumed. Just the raw, uncomplicated grief of being a 36-year-old woman whose own parents had just stood at the bottom of a staircase and watched her carry her whole life out into a rainstorm without one of them offering an umbrella. I called Priya from the back seat. She picked up on the second ring, half asleep, and the moment she heard my voice, she went instantly alert, the way only a friend who has known you for 15 years can. They actually did it, I told her, my voice steadier than I expected it to be. 60 minutes, suitcases and everything. Exactly like every worst version of this I used to joke about with you. Where are you right now? Priya's voice was already sharp, already moving into problem-solving mode. In a car, heading to the Rosewood. I'm getting on the next flight out of Chicago. Priya, you don't have to. I'm getting on the next flight, she said again, in a tone that ended the conversation entirely. You do not have to do the next 48 hours alone just because you're used to doing everything alone. That's not a strength, Vanessa. That's just a habit you never had a reason to break. She landed at LaGuardia at 6 the next morning and showed up at the Rosewood Suite still wearing yesterday's clothes, carrying 2 coffees and a small bag of pastries from a bakery near her apartment. And she sat with me on the floor of that hotel room, while I finally, fully let myself cry. Not the quiet, controlled tears from the night my acquisition closed, but the loud, messy, ugly kind that comes from finally admitting, out loud, to someone who actually loves you, that your own family has spent your entire life treating you like an afterthought. "You don't owe them anything," Priya said at one point, handing me a tissue. "Not your money, not your forgiveness, not one more year of pretending to be smaller than you are so they can feel comfortable around you." I think that sentence did more to shift how I approached the following weeks than any legal document or financial acquisition ever could have. I stopped, somewhere around that rosewood hotel room floor, treating my family's approval as something I still needed to earn, and started treating it as something I had simply, finally, stopped requiring. By the time the sun came up that morning, I had already made the decision that would eventually lead me to that conference room months later. Not out of a plan for revenge exactly, not at first. Just a quiet, settled understanding that I was done shrinking myself to fit inside their expectations, and whatever came next in my life, however it unfolded, it was going to unfold on terms I had finally, after 36 years, decided for myself. There's a part of this story I haven't told you yet, something that happened about 2 months before the flight to New York, back when my parents were still scrambling to find any solution besides admitting defeat. And I think it says almost as much about that family as the dinner table scene did. My father had an older brother, my Uncle Frank, who'd made a modest fortune years earlier flipping commercial real estate in Phoenix and had spent the following 2 decades gently reminding the rest of the family about it at every possible opportunity. My father swallowed what remained of his pride and called Frank directly, laying out the situation in careful, sanitized terms, framing it as a temporary liquidity gap rather than the full, humiliating truth of a defaulted equity line and a house sliding toward foreclosure. Frank listened for a long time without saying much, and then, according to what I later heard from my mother during one of the only conversations we had in the weeks before I cut off contact entirely, he said something that apparently stunned my father into silence. "You know, Richard, I always figured Vanessa was the one holding this whole family together," Frank said. "Quiet as she was, I used to watch her at Thanksgiving, running around, refilling drinks and helping your mother-in-law with the dishes, while the rest of you sat around bragging about commissions and contracts. And I thought to myself, that girl is the only one of the bunch actually doing anything real. Where's she at these days? Maybe she can help you out." My father, humiliated at having to explain that he had thrown me out of the house months earlier, mumbled something vague about our relationship being complicated right now, and quickly changed the subject. Frank, no fool, apparently read between the lines well enough to decline the loan request entirely, telling my father he wasn't in a position to help, given everything going on. A diplomatic way of saying he wasn't interested in bailing out a family that had discarded the one member who'd probably been quietly keeping their finances afloat for years. I only found out about that phone call secondhand, filtered through my mother's own selective retelling, but it stuck with me because it confirmed something I'd long suspected. Even the extended family, the people on the outside looking in, had a clearer read on my actual value to that household than the 4 people living inside it every day. Frank reached out to me directly about a year after everything settled, having heard through some winding family grapevine what had actually happened, and sent me a short, simple message. "I always knew you were the sharp one. Proud of you, kid. Whatever that's worth coming from an uncle who barely called enough over the years." I wrote back and thanked him, and we've stayed loosely in touch ever since, exchanging holiday messages, nothing deep, but something. A small, unexpected thread of family that didn't require me to shrink myself to keep it intact. Somebody asked me recently, in an interview I did for a business publication about a year after everything with my family came to its final, permanent close. Whether I'd ever run into Paige or Trevor by accident. Whether Dallas was small enough that our paths might have crossed since. The answer, strangely, is yes, once, though neither of them ever knew it happened. I was back in Texas for a Meridian Group event, a private dinner with a group of regional investors at a hotel downtown, and Renata had arranged for the car to stop briefly at a pharmacy so I could pick up something before the evening began. I was standing at the checkout counter when I glanced toward the cosmetics section and saw her, unmistakably, restocking a display of lipstick testers with the exact same practiced, professional smile she used to wear showing million-dollar listings to clients who never existed. Paige looked thinner than I remembered. Her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail instead of the elaborate blowouts she used to get twice a week, wearing a plain store polo instead of the designer pieces she once treated as a second skin. She was helping an older woman find a foundation shade, patient, focused, genuinely good at the small human work of making a stranger feel taken care of, and for just a moment, watching her from across the store, I felt something I hadn't expected to feel at all. Not triumph, not even satisfaction exactly. Something closer to a strange, distant recognition of a version of my sister I'd never actually gotten to see before. One who wasn't performing success for an audience. One who was simply doing an honest job well because the moment called for it. She never noticed me. I paid for my things at a different register and left before she had any chance to look up. And I didn't tell Renata or anyone else in the car what I'd seen. I've thought about that moment more than I expected to in the months since. Not with guilt, exactly, because I still believe every consequence that landed on Paige was the direct result of choices she made entirely on her own. But with something a little softer than the cold, satisfied certainty I'd carried into that conference room the day I laid 2 brown suitcases down in front of my father. I don't know if Paige has changed in any lasting way. I don't know if the version of her folding sweaters behind a cosmetics counter is closer to who she actually is underneath 31 years of performed superiority, or if she'll claw her way back to the same old patterns the second an opportunity presents itself. I genuinely don't know, and I've made a kind of peace with not knowing, because it isn't my job to track her growth anymore. It was never actually my job in the first place. It just felt that way for most of my life, because nobody else in that family had ever bothered to step into the role. Trevor, from what I understand secondhand through a mutual acquaintance in the finance world, spent about 8 months at the call center job before landing a lower-tier position at a regional insurance brokerage, a significant step down from the wealth management world he used to move through with such performed confidence. I heard he's rebuilding, slowly, methodically, the way people do when the fast, flashy version of success stops being available to them. I hope, honestly, that he's learning something real in the process, though I have no particular investment either way in how his story turns out. My parents are still in that small rental 40 minutes outside Dallas, as far as I know. My mother sends me a card every year around my birthday. Always the same careful, formal handwriting. Always some version of, thinking of you, hope you're well. Never once an actual apology. Never once an acknowledgement of what happened that night in the dining room, or what happened months later in that glass conference room. I keep the cards in a drawer in my Manhattan apartment, unanswered. Not out of spite, but because I genuinely don't know what an honest response would look like, and I'd rather send nothing than send something dishonest. My father, I'm told, still tells a version of the story at the hardware store where he works, To coworkers who have no idea the daughter he mentions in passing is the same woman whose company appears in business headlines every few months. He apparently frames it as a story about a daughter who found her own path eventually. A soft, sanitized retelling that conveniently skips the part where he stood over a dining table and gave that daughter 60 minutes to disappear from his life. I only know this because Frank mentioned it once, gently, during one of our occasional check-ins, not to needle me, but because he thought I should know how the story had been reshaped in the retelling, the way stories always get reshaped by the people who come out looking worst in the honest version. I don't feel angry when I hear these details anymore. That surprised me, honestly, the first time I noticed the anger had quietly faded into something closer to distance. For a long time after that final conference room meeting, I assumed the anger would simply become a permanent feature of who I was, a scar tissue I'd carry for the rest of my life. Instead, somewhere around the 2-year mark, it just started to soften into something more like the memory of an old injury. The kind you notice occasionally on a cold morning, but that no longer actually controls how you move through your day. If you've made it this far into my story, I want to leave you with something a little more useful than just the satisfaction of watching people who wronged me finally face consequences. Because I think that satisfaction, while real, isn't actually the most important part of what I learned. The most important part is this. The version of yourself you show people who consistently undervalue you is not obligated to be the whole truth. I spent 11 years letting my family believe I was small, unremarkable, easily dismissed. And I want to be honest that there is a real cost to that kind of prolonged self-erasure. It is lonely. It requires a level of patience most people are never asked to sustain. But it also, when done deliberately and for the right reasons, gives you something extraordinarily rare. The freedom to build an entire life, an entire identity, entirely on your own terms, without a single person's doubt or diminishment shaping the outcome. I don't think everyone needs to secretly acquire a company to prove a point to their family. That's an extreme version of a much more universal lesson. But I do think almost everyone reading this has some version of a family, a workplace, a friend group that has quietly decided who you are and stopped updating that assessment years ago, long after you'd actually grown into something they never bothered to notice. And I think the real lesson isn't about revenge at all, even though revenge is the part of the story that gets people's attention. The real lesson is about deciding for yourself that their outdated assessment of you doesn't get to be the final word on who you actually are. My family spent 36 years underestimating me because underestimating me was convenient. It let them feel superior. It let them justify never asking me a single genuine question about my life, my ambitions, my inner world, because they'd already decided, long before I ever had the chance to prove otherwise, that there was nothing much there worth asking about. They were wrong. And the day I finally let them find out just how wrong they'd been wasn't really about the suitcases or the demolition threat, or the satisfaction of watching my father's face go pale in that conference room. It was about finally, after 36 years, refusing to let anyone else's small, convenient version of me be the one that got to stand in a room and speak for who I actually was. Let me go back for a moment to that Monday morning I mentioned, the one where I was supposed to send a demolition crew to the Highland Park house. Because I think what actually happened that morning tells you more about who I've become than the boardroom confrontation ever could. I woke up early, the way I always do, and sat on my balcony in Malibu with coffee, watching the sun come up over the water, running through my calendar for the day. The demolition order sat in my inbox, drafted and ready to send, a single click away from setting an actual crew in motion toward a house that still, underneath everything, held 16 years of my own life inside its walls. Awkward Christmas mornings and quiet Tuesday nights, and the small bedroom where I'd built the earliest version of Meridian Group on a second-hand laptop balanced on my knees. I sat with that draft for almost 40 minutes before I finally picked up the phone and called the demolition contractor's office to cancel the order entirely. "You're sure?" the coordinator on the line asked, sounding a little surprised, since I'd apparently insisted on an unusually tight, urgent timeline just 3 days earlier. "We had the crew scheduled first thing tomorrow." "I'm sure," I told her. "Cancel it. I've decided to list the property for sale instead." I want to be honest about why I made that call, because I think it matters. It wasn't forgiveness, exactly. I hadn't suddenly softened toward my parents overnight, hadn't decided the 60 minutes in the rain deserved some quiet, unspoken pardon. I made that call because I realized, sitting there on my balcony, that following through on the demolition wasn't actually going to give me anything I didn't already have. The point had already been made the moment I walked into that conference room. Watching an excavator tear through a house that held real, complicated memories, not all of them bad, wasn't going to add a single ounce of satisfaction to what I'd already accomplished. It would have just been cruelty for its own sake. And I'd spent 36 years watching my family practice exactly that kind of cruelty, without ever once considering whether it served any real purpose beyond making them feel powerful. I didn't tell my parents I'd canceled the order. As far as they knew, for the 11 days between the conference room and the actual sale, the house they'd raised me in was still scheduled for demolition. And I let that uncertainty sit exactly as it was. Some might call that its own quiet cruelty. And maybe it was. I've made peace with the fact that I'm not required to be a perfectly gracious, forgiving protagonist in the aftermath of everything that happened. I gave them mercy in the end. I never promised them warmth on the way there. The house sold to that young family from Chicago 11 days later, and I donated the proceeds, after covering the outstanding debt on the equity line, to the same scholarship fund I mentioned earlier, the one supporting first-generation business students without family money or connections to fall back on. There was something quietly fitting about that, using the last physical trace of the house that raised me to fund the future of young women who might otherwise spend their 20s exactly the way I spent mine, building something real in total silence because nobody around them had bothered to notice they were capable of it. The months after the conference room confrontation were, professionally speaking, some of the busiest and most rewarding of my entire career, and I think it's worth spending some time on that, because revenge stories tend to end at the moment of triumph, as though nothing meaningful happens afterward. In reality, life kept moving, the company kept growing, and I discovered that the version of myself who no longer had to hide in plain sight at a family dinner table had a great deal more energy available for the actual work of building something. We closed our largest acquisition yet that following summer, a mid-sized creative agency out of Chicago that had built an impressive roster of consumer brand clients but lacked the capital infrastructure to compete against larger firms for the biggest accounts. I flew out personally to meet the agency's founder, a sharp, exhausted woman named Renee Castillo, who reminded me, in certain unguarded moments, of exactly how I used to feel running Meridian Group alone out of a studio apartment kitchen, stretched thin, constantly one bad quarter away from everything falling apart. I built this thing from nothing, Renee told me over coffee during our first real conversation before the deal terms were finalized. I just don't know if I have another 5 years of doing it completely alone in me. You don't have to anymore, I told her. And I meant it in a way that went beyond the standard corporate reassurance most acquiring companies offer. I structured the deal specifically to keep Renee in a leadership role with real equity, real decision-making power, rather than the more common approach of acquiring a company and quietly pushing its founder out within 18 months. I'd watched that particular pattern destroy too many talented people over the years, and I had no interest in repeating it now that I finally had the power to do things differently. Renee runs our entire Midwest division today, and she's become one of the sharpest voices in our senior leadership meetings, unafraid to push back on my own ideas when she thinks I'm wrong, which happens more often than I'd like to admit, and which I've come to genuinely value. I built Meridian Group, in large part, as a rejection of the environment I grew up in, a place where quiet competence went unnoticed, and only the loudest, flashiest performance of success ever earned real recognition. I wanted my own company to operate by different rules entirely, and watching people like Renee and Julian rise inside that structure, recognized for the actual substance of their work rather than how well they performed confidence in a room, has become one of the most satisfying parts of running this company. More satisfying, if I'm honest, than any single deal or acquisition ever could be on its own. I also started, quietly at first and then more publicly, mentoring young women coming up through finance and marketing who reminded me of an earlier version of myself, the version sitting silently at family dinners while everyone else took center stage. I don't tell them my full story right away, usually. I let them get to know me first, the way I let Marcus get to know me at that ocean conservation fundraiser, without the weight of the company name shaping every interaction from the very first handshake. Only once they trust the relationship on its own terms do I usually tell them the whole thing: the 11 years, the 2 brown suitcases, the conference room. Almost every one of them cries a little the first time they hear it, not out of pity, but out of recognition, because so many of them are quietly living some smaller version of the exact same story inside their own families right now. And hearing that it eventually turns out okay seems to matter to them more than I initially expected it would. Marcus, the marine biologist, proposed to me about 18 months after we met, on the same stretch of Malibu coastline where my sister once stood, taking photographs of a house she had no idea I owned. He didn't do anything elaborate. No hired photographer hiding in the dunes, no orchestrated flash mob, nothing designed to be filmed and posted and performed for an audience. He simply asked me to take an early morning walk with him along the water, the way we did most Sundays when I was in town. And about halfway down the beach, he stopped, pulled a small ring box out of his jacket pocket, and asked if I'd spend the rest of my life with someone who genuinely could not care less how many zeros sat behind my name in a bank statement. I said yes before he even finished the sentence. We got married the following spring, a small ceremony on that same stretch of coastline, maybe 60 guests total. Most of them Meridian Group employees who had become something closer to chosen family over the years. Plus Priya, who cried through the entire ceremony despite insisting beforehand that she absolutely would not. And Uncle Frank, who flew in from Phoenix and gave a short, warm toast about watching me grow into exactly the woman he'd always suspected I could become, if anyone in the family had bothered to actually look. I did not invite my parents. I did not invite Paige or Trevor. Some people, hearing that detail, assume it must have come from some lingering, unresolved bitterness. And maybe there's a small kernel of truth in that assumption somewhere underneath everything else. But mostly, it came from a much simpler place. A wedding is a room full of the people who actually see you, who actually showed up for the difficult, unglamorous years before the visible success arrived, and I no longer felt any obligation to make space in that room for people who had only ever shown up, loudly and enthusiastically, for the parts of my life that were easy to brag about. Marcus knew almost everything about my family before we got married. The full, unvarnished version, not the sanitized story my father apparently tells his coworkers at the hardware store. He asked me once, gently, during our engagement, whether I ever thought about reaching out, offering some kind of final closure, a conversation that might let both sides say the things that were never said in that conference room. I don't need it, I told him, and I meant it. I already said everything I needed to say. They just weren't in a position to hear any of it, and I don't think they ever will be. Some doors don't need a formal closing ceremony. Some doors just quietly stop being doors you walk through anymore. He nodded and never brought it up again, which is one of 100 small reasons I knew, long before that morning on the beach, that I'd finally found someone worth building the rest of my life around. A little over a year after the conference room confrontation, a national business magazine ran a cover story finally putting a name and a face to the reclusive founder behind Meridian Group's rise. A profile I agreed to only after years of declining every single interview request that had ever landed on Julian's desk. I agreed in the end, mostly because I wanted to control the narrative myself, rather than let some version of my story leak out secondhand, filtered through speculation and half-truths, the way these things sometimes eventually do. The reporter, a sharp, patient woman named Alicia Grant, who had covered corporate finance for nearly 2 decades, spent almost 3 full days with me, shadowing meetings, touring the Manhattan headquarters, sitting in on a leadership call where Renee pushed back hard on one of my proposed budget allocations for the following quarter and won the argument entirely on the strength of her numbers. Near the end of our final interview session, sitting in my corner office as the sun went down over Midtown, Alicia asked me the question I'd been quietly dreading and quietly expecting in equal measure. "You built this entire company in secret for over a decade," she said, flipping back through her notes. "Most founders in your position, once they finally step into the spotlight, want to talk about the grind, the sacrifice, the hustle. You've barely mentioned any of that today. What I keep coming back to is your family. You grew up in a house in Texas, worked an entry-level job for years while building this in the background, and from what my research turned up, there was some kind of significant falling out. Are you willing to talk about that at all?" I sat with the question for a long moment, watching the lights of the city start to flicker on below the window, and decided, for the first time publicly, to tell at least a version of the truth. My family valued the appearance of success far more than the substance of it, I told her. For most of my life, that meant I was invisible to them, because the actual work I was doing didn't look impressive from the outside. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't something you could brag about at a dinner party. And there came a point where that invisibility turned into something closer to active cruelty. And I made a decision, in that moment, that I was done shrinking myself to accommodate people who had already decided who I was without ever bothering to actually find out. "Do you regret keeping the company secret for so long?" Alicia asked. "Some might say you could have avoided a lot of that pain by simply telling your family the truth years earlier." "I've thought about that a great deal," I admitted. "And I don't think the pain was actually optional, honestly. I think the pain was baked into the relationship long before Meridian Group ever existed. The company just gave it a very specific, very dramatic final chapter. If I'd told them the truth years earlier, I think they would have found some other way to make me feel small anyway, because that was the actual dynamic at the core of the relationship, not a single misunderstanding that better communication could have fixed." The article ran 2 months later, under a headline that made me wince slightly when I first saw it. The quiet billionaire who let her family underestimate her into oblivion. It was more dramatic phrasing than I would have chosen myself, but the piece itself, when I finally read the finished version, felt honest in a way I genuinely appreciated. Alicia didn't turn my story into a simple revenge fantasy. She sat with the complexity of it, the loneliness of those 11 years, the genuine grief buried underneath the eventual triumph. And I think that honesty is part of why the piece ended up resonating with so many readers who reached out afterward, sharing quieter, smaller versions of the same story from their own families. I heard, through Frank, that my father read the article at the hardware store on his lunch break, silently, and didn't say a single word about it to any of his coworkers for the rest of the day. I don't know what that silence meant to him. I've stopped trying to guess what anything means to him anymore. That particular kind of guessing, spending my own emotional energy trying to interpret my parents' reactions to my life, was a habit I finally let myself retire, somewhere in the space between that conference room and the morning Marcus asked me to marry him on the beach. I also want to walk you through the full version of Paige's meeting with her broker, because I only gave you the short summary of it earlier, and the actual scene, as it was described to me later by Georgia herself during an unrelated business dinner where our paths happened to cross, deserves a little more room to breathe. Georgia had called Paige into her office on a Thursday morning, the same week the fake football player deal was supposed to be closing, and Paige walked in still riding the high of having told half the office she was days away from the biggest commission of her career. "I need the signed letter of intent," Georgia said, not looking up from her desk. "The one you told me was coming from the athletes' representation team. It was due Monday." "There's been a delay," Paige said smoothly, the same easy confidence she'd used her entire life to talk her way past inconvenient details. "His agent is finalizing some contract terms on the NFL side first. It's a timing thing. Totally normal for a deal this size." "What's the agent's name?" Georgia finally looked up. "I'd like to reach out directly, confirm the timeline myself, given how much is riding on this listing." Paige hesitated for just a fraction of a second too long. "I'd rather keep the communications centralized through me, honestly. These high-profile clients get nervous when too many people start reaching out." "Paige." Georgia's voice went flat and hard in a way Paige had never heard from her before. "I called the athlete's actual agency this morning. A completely different agency, by the way. One that has represented him exclusively for the past 3 years. They have never heard of you. They've never heard of your brother-in-law. And the client you claim is interested in a 9-figure Malibu property signed a lease 2 weeks ago on an entirely different house through an entirely different broker in an entirely different state." The color drained out of Paige's face in real time, according to Georgia's telling, and for a long moment she said nothing at all, apparently searching for some version of the story that might still hold together under scrutiny, and finding, for the first time in longer than she'd care to admit, absolutely nothing. "I panicked," Paige finally admitted, her voice cracking. "The commissions have been so dry, and I just needed something to show for myself, and I thought if I could just get the listing, I could figure out a real buyer before anyone noticed the timeline was off." "You lied to this entire office about a client relationship that never existed," Georgia said, "to secure the confidential listing of one of the most sensitive properties this firm has ever handled. Do you have any idea what would have happened to my reputation? To this entire brokerage if that owner's team had found out we let an unverified fantasy walk through their front door?" Paige had no answer for that, because there wasn't one. She cleaned out her desk that same afternoon, carrying a small cardboard box past coworkers who had, only days earlier, been congratulating her on landing the deal of a lifetime, and drove home in a silence she later described to Trevor as the loudest silence she'd ever sat inside. I want to go back and actually walk you through the 60 minutes after that conference room meeting, because I only gave you the summary earlier, and I think the real-time version matters, especially for anyone who's ever wondered what it actually looks like when the family that once controlled every hour of your life suddenly runs out of time themselves. The moment I left, according to what Renata later pieced together from the building's own security footage, which I'll admit I did eventually watch, once, out of a curiosity I couldn't quite talk myself out of, my mother sat frozen at the stone table for nearly 2 full minutes before she moved at all. My father was the one who finally reached for the suitcases, his hands visibly shaking as he unzipped the first one, staring down into the empty lining as though it might somehow contain an answer he hadn't thought to ask for yet. "We need to call someone," my mother kept repeating, her voice climbing toward hysteria. "A lawyer. Frank. Somebody. This can't just happen. There has to be a process, a review, something." "There's no process, Elaine." My father's voice had gone hollow, stripped of the commanding tone he'd used at that dinner table months earlier. "She holds the note. She just showed us the paperwork. There's nothing to appeal." Paige sat in stunned silence for most of those 2 minutes, staring at the framed magazine covers visible through the glass wall of the conference room. The same ones she'd walked past on the way in without a second glance. Headlines about the reclusive founder of Meridian Group she now understood, with a sick, dropping clarity, had been sitting across the dinner table from her for over a decade. "She was right there," Paige finally said, almost to herself. "The whole time. Every dinner. Every Christmas. She just let us." She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence, unable to fully articulate the shape of what her family had actually done for 11 straight years without ever once suspecting it. Trevor said nothing at all. He simply stood, walked to the glass wall, and stared out at the skyline for a long moment. And Renata told me later, when she eventually recounted the footage to me, that his shoulders had the particular slumped stillness of a man doing quiet, devastating math in his head, adding up exactly how much he'd lost, not just that week, but across the entire span of a marriage built on a foundation that had just been revealed as considerably less solid than he'd assumed. They left the building 23 minutes later, according to the lobby security logs, carrying the 2 brown suitcases between them, my father's hand gripping one handle with a kind of white-knuckled determination, as though holding on to the suitcase itself might somehow hold together whatever remained of his dignity. They didn't speak in the elevator. They didn't speak in the lobby. The receptionist who'd greeted them so warmly that morning watched them leave in complete silence. And if she noticed the difference between the confident family that had walked in and the shattered one walking out, she never said a word about it to anyone. Which is, I've come to learn, exactly the kind of professional discretion I pay my building's front-of-house staff very well to maintain. I found out later, again through Frank, that they spent that first night back in Dallas in a budget motel near the airport, the same kind of place my father would have once considered beneath his family entirely. 4 adults crammed into 2 double beds, nobody sleeping much, the 2 brown suitcases sitting open and half-packed on the floor between them. A strange, silent echo of exactly the scene they'd created for me months earlier, right down to the cheap, worn fabric and the frayed zippers. I didn't feel joy when I heard those details. I want to be honest about that because I think the genre this story belongs to often wants a cleaner, more triumphant version of the aftermath than the one that actually happened. What I felt was something closer to a long, slow exhale. The physical sensation of finally setting down a weight I'd been carrying since I was old enough to understand that my family's love came with conditions none of the other people at that table had ever been required to meet. Now let me tell you about Trevor's actual final conversation with the Marcus Webb account, because I only summarized it earlier, and the full version is worth hearing. It happened 3 days before the dinner where Paige first read my termination notice out loud, which means, strangely, Trevor had already lost the deal that would have saved him before he ever stood up at that table and lectured me about cutting dead weight. He simply hadn't told anyone yet, hoping, in the particular desperate way people hope when they haven't fully accepted a loss, that some last-minute miracle might still reverse the outcome. He was sitting in his cramped office when the confirmation email arrived. Not a call this time, just a short, formal message from Marcus's assistant confirming the transfer of the account to Meridian Group's Wealth Division, effective immediately, along with a brief note thanking Trevor for his years of dedicated service, in language so clearly templated that it landed harder than a more personal rejection might have. Trevor read the email 4 times, according to what he later admitted to Paige during one of their final, bitter arguments after everything came apart, and then he closed his laptop, sat in the dark of his office for nearly an hour, and drove to that family dinner anyway, because canceling would have meant explaining why, and explaining why was not a conversation he was prepared to have with anyone, least of all himself. That's the detail that stays with me most, honestly. More than the suitcases, more than the conference room. Trevor stood at that table and told me, with total, unearned confidence, that in his business, you cut dead weight the moment it stops performing. Entirely unaware that he himself had already been cut, quietly, efficiently, by the exact same standard he was so eager to apply to me. EOF. Not with sadness exactly, not anymore, but with a kind of quiet, respectful distance. The way you might look back at an old photograph of yourself during a hard winter and feel grateful, mostly, that she kept walking forward instead of turning around and knocking on that door, begging to be let back in. She didn't know, standing there with rain soaking through her blazer, exactly how the following months would unfold. She didn't know about the conference room, or the 2 brown suitcases waiting patiently in a storage unit for their eventual return, or the demolition order she'd draft and then quietly cancel, or the marine biologist she hadn't met yet, who would someday propose to her on a beach she already owned, but hadn't yet learned to think of as home. She just knew, standing there in the rain, that she was done being small for people who had never once earned the privilege of underestimating her. There's one more piece of this story I want to tell you before I close it out. Something small that happened almost 2 years after everything settled, because I think it's the clearest example of how completely my life had shifted by then, measured not against the drama of the conference room, but against something much quieter. I was in Dallas again for a Meridian Group site visit, considering the city for a new regional office, given how much of our client base had grown across the Southwest, and Julian had booked us into a hotel downtown for a 2-day stretch of meetings. On the second morning, running early for a breakfast meeting, I stepped into the hotel's small coffee shop and found myself standing in line behind a woman who looked, for one disorienting second, exactly like my mother used to look 15 years earlier. The same careful posture, the same way of holding a purse close against her side as though guarding it from an invisible threat. It wasn't her, of course. Just a stranger with a passing resemblance, gone the moment she turned to collect her order, and I saw a completely unfamiliar face. But the jolt of it stayed with me for the rest of that morning, sitting through a meeting about regional expansion strategy, while some small, quiet part of my mind kept circling back to the version of myself who would have spent that entire meeting distracted, anxious, replaying old arguments instead of focusing on quarterly projections. I realized, somewhere around the second cup of coffee, that the anxious version of myself hadn't shown up at all. I'd simply noted the resemblance, felt the brief jolt, and moved on with my day, the way you might notice a stranger who reminds you of an old coworker from a job you left years earlier, present for a moment, gone just as quickly, entirely without weight. That, more than the conference room, more than the suitcases, more than any single dramatic confrontation, felt like the real ending of this story to me. Not the moment I finally had the power to make my family face consequences, but the ordinary Tuesday morning, 2 years later, when a stranger's face in a coffee line no longer had the power to derail an entire day. Healing, I've come to understand, rarely announces itself with the same theatrical clarity as revenge does. It just quietly shows up, one Tuesday morning, in a coffee shop, in a city you used to associate entirely with people who never saw you clearly, and lets you order your coffee and get on with your meeting without so much as a second thought. I think about that 36-year-old woman standing on her parents' driveway in the freezing February rain more often than you might expect, given everything that came after. Not with sadness, exactly. Not anymore. But with a kind of quiet, respectful distance. The way you might look back at an old photograph of yourself during a hard winter and feel grateful, mostly, that she kept walking forward instead of turning around and knocking on that door, begging to be let back in. She didn't know, standing there with rain soaking through her blazer, exactly how the following months would unfold. She didn't know about the conference room or the 2 brown suitcases waiting patiently in a storage unit for their eventual return, or the demolition order she'd draft and then quietly cancel, or the marine biologist she hadn't met yet, who would someday propose to her on a beach she already owned, but hadn't yet learned to think of as home. She just knew, standing there in the rain, that she was done being small for people who had never once earned the privilege of underestimating her. I've had almost 3 years now to sit with everything that happened, and I want to be honest about one more thing before I let you go, because I think it would be dishonest to end this story making it sound cleaner than it actually was. There were moments, plenty of them, in the months right after that conference room, when I second-guessed myself. Late at night, usually, unable to sleep, I'd replay the whole thing and wonder whether I'd gone too far, whether the version of justice I'd handed my family was really justice at all, or whether it had simply been the most expensive, most elaborate tantrum a hurt 36-year-old woman had ever thrown. I brought that exact worry to Priya one evening, sitting on her back porch with a glass of wine, watching her kids chase fireflies across the yard. "You're allowed to hold 2 things at once," she told me, in the calm, precise way she says most important things. "You can believe completely that they earned every consequence that landed on them, and still feel the weight of having been the one who delivered it. That doesn't mean you were wrong. It just means you're a person who still has a conscience, which, frankly, is more than I can say for most of the people who raised you." I've held on to that sentence a lot over the past 3 years. It doesn't erase the discomfort entirely, but it reframes it into something I can actually live with, something closer to evidence of my own decency rather than proof that I did something I shouldn't have. My family spent 36 years teaching me that love was conditional, that value had to be performed loudly to count, that quiet, steady competence deserved nothing but dismissal. The fact that I still felt a flicker of guilt while enforcing consequences they had, by any reasonable measure, thoroughly earned, tells me I never actually absorbed their worst lesson. I just learned how to survive inside a system built on it, quietly, for 11 years, until I finally had the power to walk away from that system entirely. If you're watching this, and some version of that scene feels familiar, if you've ever sat at a family dinner table and felt entirely invisible while someone louder, flashier, more willing to perform their success got all the attention and all the credit, I want you to hear this clearly. Your quiet, unglamorous, difficult work still counts. It counts even when nobody at that table claps for it. It counts even when your own parents forget your birthday because they're too busy staging someone else's open house. It counts especially then, actually, because the version of yourself you're building in private, away from anyone's doubt or diminishment, tends to end up sturdier, more resilient, more entirely your own than anything you'd have built while performing for an audience that was never actually paying attention in the first place. I don't know what your version of the conference room looks like. Maybe it's a promotion nobody in your family believes you actually earned. Maybe it's a small business finally turning a profit after years of your relatives quietly assuming it would fail. Maybe it's simply the day you stop returning calls from people who only ever reach out when they need something from you. Whatever it looks like, I hope you get there. I hope you get to stand in your own version of that room, whatever form it takes, and finally, fully understand exactly how wrong they were about you. And when you get there, I hope you remember something I had to learn the hard way. Standing in that glass conference room with 2 suitcases sliding across a stone table. The goal was never actually to destroy them. The goal was simply to stop needing them to see you clearly, because you'd finally, fully learn to see yourself. That's the whole story. My name is Vanessa Cole. I'm 37 years old now, married to a man who has never once asked me what my net worth is, running a company that employs 4,000 people who know exactly how much their quiet, careful work actually matters here. My family threw me out into the rain with 2 suitcases and 60 minutes, fully convinced they were disciplining a failure back into shape. What they actually did, without meaning to, without understanding a single thing about who I already was underneath the quiet exterior they'd spent 36 years dismissing, was hand me the exact permission I needed to finally stop hiding. If this story resonated with you even a little, let me know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. And if you've ever had to walk away from people who only valued you for what you could quietly provide them, hit like and subscribe, because there are a lot more of us out here than any of us usually realize. And I'd love for you to stick around for the next one.